So do you think that, say, Jessica's style or Lauren Isley, someone that's more inherently poetic, they wouldn't be able to sustain a novel like that because they don't have the greasing the wheels effect so much? I mean, there's a few humorous moments in both of their works, but they're not as uh, they don't have as much silliness, I should say, as some of the sections here do.
Well, Jessica, as I said, is poetic in an interior sense. Her poesy is within the word choices and the lines. I'm, Jessica's building, a Taj Mahal, whereas I'm building sort of super pyramids in the sense that Jessica is going to have the grace of the Taj Mahal roof. She's going to have the gleaming white. And even though the original pyramids were gleaming, mine are more these edifices. But you do get certain poetry. There is a poesy in the everyday. If you've read my poems, you know that I can match poesy with Jessica's prose or Hart Crane's poetry or Wallace Stevens's poetry, but it's a way to do something totally different because I wouldn't want to just necessarily have recapitulated some of the poesy of my poetry in the prose. Although there are certainly moments of great uh, poetic nature. The whole sneaker incident that I've talked about with Big Frank that happens later in the book is a perfect example of that. It's very plain spoken. Big Frank isn't, monologuing or soliloquizing like Hamlet, but the whole scene is very touching. It gives an insight that Big Frank might at some point be a decent person or was a decent person, even though if we know what he did during World War II, he was a murderer back then. If we know the Vincetti brothers, we get a sense of an anti-Bildungsroman. Big Frank is getting worse as he's getting older. He's not getting better. But there's a poesy in that. There's a poesy in these memories. So I'm there is it it gets to sort of the fractalism is I'm working on poesy at a not necessarily a more intricate level. Jessica's poetry is small and intricate. Jessica is sort of like making little figurines. She's mastering a clock, an old stopwatch. Whereas I'm building a huge pyramid, or I'm building some grandiose Leonardo da Vinci kind of flying machine. Whether it flies or not, there is, as absurd looking as some of those diagrams may be, they do have a certain beauty to them. So I'm more likely to find not beauty in ugliness, which is a cliche, but I'm the worth of ugliness, the worth of prose as an anti-poesy.
That cliche, as trite as it is, it does have some connotations with truth.
Yeah.
I found certain sections of this, they work as an anti-chorus, sort of. You can appreciate them for the poetics, but on the other hand, you can also see a lot of the worst natures of human beings in these characters. The Before we get into some more specific scenes, you brought up an interesting tangent. Jessica was talking to me, we were Skyping a while ago, and she mentioned to me Thomas Wolfe's Of Time and the River, and an 85-page sequence where he's just observing things.
Yeah.
Did that influence the Frank Shoelaces section?
No, I've never read Tom. I think I read one short story of his, and maybe I think he might have done a journalism piece, but I haven't read Of Time on the River or of Homeward Angel. Look, Homeward Angel. I've not read him. It's one of the things I'd like to do, but at this point in my life, I'm just not finding my inspiration from writing. It's one of those things that uh, I look back and I wish I had more time when I was a youth, and by youth I mean in my teens, that I could have read more instead of being more of a delinquent. But hopefully, if I live another 30 or 40 years, I'll read that, and it may open things up for me. But right now, film and uh, life experience, my own poetry, little things that happen in my own life, uh, jobs, disappointments, medical things. These are the things that are fueling me. So if you find anything like that, Jessica has mentioned certain things, but I've never read Thomas Wolfe other than I think one short story that I read many years ago. I've read Tom Wolfe, the journalist, more than I've read Thomas Wolfe, the novelist.
Uh, the other thing too about that is it seems like when you compare the poetic side of you before you went to prose, that you would get a lot more fodder from the poems, whereas you've told me here and you've told me in private that you don't get that as much with prose. You certainly read far more than the average layman, but seems like film work more as fodder for you in terms of your prose.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, La Dolce Vita. There are other films, like I said, whatchamacall, Killing of a Chinese Bookie and Rocco and His Brothers are the two pillars that are the foundation of the Vincetti brothers.
And why do you think that is? Why do you get? And Jessica was telling me too that you had a large section of terrible books from all sorts of dogger lists that you keep because you may use it for fodder.
Well, that's 7 or 8 boxes worth, and I have them
Yes.
like marked off like Dead White Males, Bad PC Poets.
I know they're very amusing titles. But film, I think I was talking to another E-lister, Thomas Evans, about this. Film probably contains some of the best writers, period, anyway. I mean, there's Woody Allen and Ingmar Bergman. There's Stanley Kubrick and Orson Welles would apply too, but they're on it. No, you can't really compare them in the same way of pure writers. But they have sections of them that are sterling prose. So I could certainly see why film would be a good transition. Film is often thought of as purely visual and closer to painting or photography when it is far more akin to literature.
I actually interviewed someone who I forget, was it an actor or maybe one of my creative interviews on creativity. Someone had actually said that, and I agreed with them. It's rare to hear people acknowledge it. No, it was the guy I interviewed last week who was talking about the independent film company. He was the guy who brought that up. Yeah, as far as the bad poets, you can always look at a bad poem that has a theme or a subject matter that I can say, oh, I can do that much better. So if I'm flipping through, page 43 of 88 pages of crap, I say, oh, that's an interesting idea, but this person has no talent. Let me do a poem on the same thing, and I could, there are probably a couple of hundred of my great poems that their genesis was exactly that. So I'm not getting rid of those bad books of poetry. Later this year or early next year when I finish this next book, I told Jessica, I want to get rid of most of the books that we have that are in public domain, the physical books, because I can get them now from Project Gutenberg. They're just taking up shelf space. I probably got about 4 or 5 shelves worth of stuff, several hundred books. I'll keep one physical copy. I've got my 5 novels of James Joyce, a nice leather-bound book, and Moby Dick. I'll keep that, but there's no need for a lot of the excess books that I have, especially books that are factual books, almanac type books. When I can look that now up online, it's just a way of getting rid of stuff. But the bad poetry isn't ever going to even make it online. And I think I've said before, I've read more poetry than any human being that's ever lived. By milestones, because I know I've gotten many poetry editors who say, oh, they have 5 or 6 people on their staff, and they'll say, oh, you don't understand, and we put out a quarterly, and in a quarter we get 400 or 500 poems sent to us to be read. They'll have 5 people have 3 months to read 100 poems each. I've gotten probably 250,000 emails with maybe upwards of 1 million poems that have been sent to me. I don't read them all because a lot of them, the dogger list, I now go straight to my spam box or whatnot. But I've read hundreds of thousands of poems just online without even going to all the books that I have, that you can see in the background, some of them.
And I've always thought it a waste of time when you see something that's, unless you're reviewing it, of course, to read something like Infinite Jest, which doesn't have anything in it really for fodder besides how terrible it is, which is why it would work for a review, and 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 sustain your interest in that. Even, I mean, it has no value whatsoever. Um, so I could see some people have made claims about you where you'll take on certain writers and waste your time with it, but I certainly don't see exposing the frauds as a waste of time. It's just that what I find a waste of time is reading a lot of that shit and continuing reading it,
Well,
which
it's
I'm sure that you
the,
don't
the
do.
the most important thing that a critic does is to separate the bad from the good. And you cannot simply praise the good stuff without going on the bad. It's dishonest to do that. It's a dishonest approach to criticism. One of the things that I know that I've had to do in the last year or so is, you know, I've got a backlog of maybe 40 or 50 film reviews that I'll slowly put out, maybe 10 or 12 per year over the next few years, because I'm just not in the mood to review films. I've reviewed so many of the great films. You know, a couple of years ago, I would have written a review of this Moby Dick film that I watched last Saturday, but I just don't have the fucking time. You know, mortal limits set in. It's more important for me to write now my books. And how many times can I say that Steven Spielberg is a hack, or that Ron Howard is even worse, or whatnot? You know, I mean, I could, you know, I'm going to go hopefully on some of these podcasts and I'll rip some of these people, but I just don't have the time to write 2,000 words that bespeak the obvious things that are obvious to anyone who's intelligent. You know, I've got 1,200 plus essays and reviews online. That's more than most critics will produce in a lifetime. So.